Thank you both for these presentations that were very enlightening to get an introduction on the subject. Before we move to the Q&A, I would just like to say a few words about the C2GLearn program. This is a program we've put together where you have different levels of information for those of you who are interested in diving a little bit deeper into these questions of climate altering approaches. So we've broken up the C2GLearn program in different blocks, and this is part of the introduction series. But if you want to go in a little bit more detail, we have a focus series on policy and governance, another one on regions and stakeholders, one on technology and science, and we're working on one to talk about the new research on these subjects. So you will probably have noticed that we are organizing an ambitious program of webinars to continue catalyzing this conversation on the importance of the governance related to these issues. Okay, so while people are formulating their questions in the Q&A box, take advantage of having these two incredible panelists with us to answer your questions. These opportunities don't come around the corner very often. We have a first question that I will address to both Thelma and Arunabha as an introductory question to open this conversation. Basically the question is, where in the world are the considerations of these potential CDR and SRM approaches taking place, and where should they be taking place? Where is this conversation advancing, and where is it absent? I think this is an interesting question to kind of get a feeling for where these conversations is obviously interesting to see that the IPCC is working on these questions, and interesting to see how these questions are being or not being addressed in certain other spaces. So I think, Thelma, you look like you're ready to answer the question.
Okay, so thank you, Alia. So let me take a go on this question from two aspects, and also from the IPCC, looking from the IPCC framework. Obviously, when we look at the publications on these issues, and basically we have had these issues being addressed in the last assessment report of the IPCC from 2013 and 2014, both in the working group 1 contribution on physical basis of climate change and also on mitigation. And then more recently in the 1.5 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So when we look, because IPCC only assesses the literature available worldwide, we still see a concentration of the research in a lot of developed countries. So there needs to be an amplification of the treatment of these subjects, both in CDR and SRM, more globally, I would say, so that we would have a broader perspective and vision from different regions of the world. So every assessment that IPCC does, it sees more pieces of literature being assessed. And the one thing that it's good about the findings of the IPCC, they come linked to a calibration language, like the degree of confidence that we are putting in some of the findings, and also the agreement among the different pieces of literature that IPCC assesses. So it is not being selectively inside, okay, so I'm going to go this way or that way. No, it has to reflect broadly what is there on these subjects, and associating to it a high level of agreement, medium level of agreement, high level of agreement, or even the confidence attributed to that. So we know that these subjects are still in their infancy, as IPCC has mentioned. So there is a lot to be done. But at the same time, and now going to the second aspect of my answer to you, Alia, regards where are these issues being discussed presently? So when we talk about the governance because we see especially the different options that you have under each one of these approaches may have different implications. And especially, when we talk about the solar radiation modification that might affect differently different regions of the world in terms of, and I think Arunabha has already mentioned some of these impacts, which are not going to be distributed equally. So you have an issue that is important to take the views and visions of every one country. So where can you do this? So essentially, we think that, institutional arrangements where this, these options, climate altering approaches could be addressed. And I think most importantly, on the international arena, you would think of the the Climate Change Convention as being a place where these things could be discussed. Are they being discussed there? No, they are not being discussed there yet. However, we do see the increasing need to at least have some guidance from an international institutional arrangement like the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, WMO. So you have several spaces for these discussions that would be inclusive. So I think that the point that I want to make is that in particular for solar radiation modification, it has to be an inclusive process, not only to discuss how these things could be launched or deployed, but also, as Arunabha has mentioned in his last piece, we also need to have the governments of the research on these issues. And when we say governments of the research, it goes back to what I have said, engaging, because everyone needs to be aware. So this inclusiveness is absolutely necessary. But from some of the options in the CDR, you need a little bit more of the national governance, like being multi-level governance, as IPCC mentions, which is engaging non-state actors, industry, civil society, scientific institutions. But so some of these might be tackled within the national, subnational level, like, the management, land use management, and how, at these different levels, you would see you would see the management of land use, and in particular with bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage, large scale afforestation and reforestation, in particular because these were the ones most assessed by the IPCC in the integrated models that they used in the special report on 1.5. But obviously, you have other sensitive issues under CDR as well, like ocean fertilization, which has already been dealt under the Convention of the Biological Diversity since 2010, when they say that none of the geoengineering, as it was called, the broad, CDR and SRM approaches before. Now we have split it into, at least in the IPCC, saying that none of these approaches that could have an impact on biodiversity should be deployed. So I think that this gives more or less a broad vision of how this is being handled so far.
Thank you, Thelma. Arunabha, would you like to chime in also? We'd be interested to know your perspective on whether this conversation, if from your perspective, if it's advancing, if it's absent in certain places, and where you think that this should be taking place.
Sure, thank you, Alia, and once again, many thanks for having me on this, and it's always a delight to be in a conversation with Thelma. I think there are 4 ways in which your question can be cut up. Who is discussing and who's not discussing? Where is it being discussed and where is it not being discussed? What is being discussed and what's not being discussed? And the question of when. If I think about 10 years ago when I first started looking at the governance of climate altering technologies, at that time, the WHO was a very small group of scientists. I would count them in less than maybe 100 or maybe even less than 50 scientists around the world who might have been working on the research in these areas. You have to recognize that since 2006, when Paul Crutzen published that paper suggesting that we should be thinking seriously about solar radiation modification and other climate altering technologies, there has been an uptick in the curve. And since then, of course, over the past decade, there's been a large number of scientists getting involved, but it's still a small subset of all climate scientists. So I would think what needs to happen there is that you need to involve a lot more of the climate scientists that are not in the developed world, and which is where the second question of where comes in. There's a lot of research happening in the US. There's a lot of research happening in the EU, some research happening in Japan, and then maybe some emerging economies like China. China has a national program now. Maybe a few researchers in India, maybe a few researchers in Brazil and elsewhere are looking into this. But beyond the geographical expansion, I also feel that there are forums that need to engage on this subject. And Thelma's presentation brings this out very clearly. The IPCC scientific reports outline very clearly the pathways, the different pathways by which you can get into negative emissions territory to limit temperature rise. But beyond the IPCC, we're not yet discussing this in the UNFCCC. We're not discussing this in the UN Environment Program. A year ago, at the 4th UN Environment Assembly, Switzerland and several other countries put forward a proposal that some assessment of the science should be done, and the proposal was voted down. So I think the forums also need to expand, which brings me to the third part, which is what is being discussed. Of course, at a planetary level, we're doing the science. And then there's a lot of research happening around, can you do, say, solar modification to protect the melting of glaciers in the Arctic? But then there are, the bulk of the population of the world live between the tropics. So disproportionate amount of research is perhaps happening on impacts in parts of the world which are much more thinly populated compared to the parts of the world that are likely to get significantly impacted because of their large population concentrations. And what also is not getting discussed enough is the governance, notwithstanding conversations such as this. Which brings me to my final point about when. And we can't think of climate altering technologies as at one end of the spectrum, where once we've exhausted all other options, then we start thinking about it. Because then it might be too late. That is not to say that I or C2G is endorsing any of these technologies, but I think the conversation on the science and the governance needs to happen simultaneously with all the conversations around enhancing ambition for mitigation, thinking about resilience against climate risks, and thinking about what to do up to 2030, out to 2050, and of course, out to 2100.
Thank you, Arunabha. And going back to what you just mentioned, clearly we can't be thinking about these solutions when we've run out of other options. A question for Thelma. You mentioned that the longer the higher the overshoot of 1.5 degrees, the more reliance on CDR is necessary. What should that mean for how we think about and govern CDR?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and then and also I would say on the side of the CDR, but also how do we think that SRM would come into play? And obviously, on the literature that IPCC has assessed, in particular in the special report on 1.5, only supports the solar radiation modification as a supplement to deep mitigation, only for overshoot scenarios. And then as you mentioned, if we go, in a pathway with a high overshoot, then we are going to have to rely not only on CDR. CDR comes first on the top of hopefully ambitious mitigation efforts globally, and then but we know that from the potential of the CDR options, if we have this portfolio of, we always think of a portfolio of options, not a single one to help us, achieve or go into the track of a pathway that is consistent to 1.5. So if we look at the potential, if you put all the options together, the CDR, they will not be sufficient if you go high overshoot. Even if you put all of them together, which obviously are in a very different level of maturity today. So most of them are still in demonstration. Some of them are under research. So it is hard to really see the potential impacts of these. Even when we think about afforestation and reforestation, which is a mature technology, let's say, it's a mature option, let's say. In large scale, if applicable in large scale, we don't really know about the potential negative effects. So the scientific literature, does not have a clear assessment of that. And also where we are going to do these options, like even afforestation and reforestation, if you do it in the boreal regions, it might contribute to warming. So it doesn't have the same effect. So we still have lots of open questions about the potential implications of these. So obviously, I think that the IPCC is so clear when it says we can limit global warming to 1.5 at the end of this century, both pre-industrial levels. So we can do it without having to rely potentially to SRM, which has still several issues to be resolved, like social acceptance, ethical issues. So we still have many issues to be resolved, more than I would say in some of the options for CDR. So we see that, there are pathways where you don't have to rely heavily on SRM, but the IPCC does include, a great contribution in all the pathways that IPCC assessed. The CDR is there. So there is an important contribution from the carbon dioxide removal options. In particular, the integrated assessment models that IPCC assessed for the 1.5 consistent pathways, they relied mainly on BECCS, which is the bioenergy, is carbon dioxide capture and removal, and also in large scale afforestation and reforestation. So looking individually at these, without disconsidering that you have other options on the table, each one with different aspects, with different costs, with different, let's say, feasibility constraints. Not necessarily technological, but you have the social acceptance of this. So we already saw in the case of ocean fertilization, for instance, that you already have, as I already mentioned, the Convention on the Biological Diversity already expressing concerns with some of these options, right? But anyway, in any of the pathways, there is reliance on CDR. What we hope to have is a very ambitious mitigation of emission reductions, let's say, globally, so that the need to have to rely heavily on all these CDR options or big portfolio, and also on SRM only for the overshoot pathways would be more limited.
Thank you, Thelma. Arunabha, do you want to chime in on this? The higher the overshoot, the more we need to rely on CDR. And so what exactly does that mean of how we think and govern CDR?
So this is where, in my presentation outline, what is the signal we are trying to send with the research that we are undertaking, either in CDR technologies or in SRM technologies. Is the signal that this is a last resort when all else has failed? Or is this a signal that there's a first resort, that I'm actually going to stop working on limiting emissions and going to focus and put all my eggs into some mythical basket of being able to suck carbon out of the atmosphere? And to me, of course, from a equation perspective, of course, the more we overshoot, the more we have to suck out. Because what SRM does not do is it does not change the concentration of carbon already in the atmosphere. It only prevents future warming in terms of limiting the amount of heat reaching the Earth's surface. So that's what the equation says. Then the question arises as to what are we evaluating the CDR options on? Is it, as again Thelma pointed out, a lot of the analysis in the IPCC report does look at under one pathway, a huge amount coming from bioenergy, carbon capture, and sequestration. Now, we know that that's going to require a lot of land. So where are you going to do it? Is it going to be, again, in densely populated parts of the world and take away land that's devoted to agriculture? Or are you going to do it somewhere else, right? So a few weeks ago, David Murrow, Michael Thompson, who's also participating in this webinar, and a few others, including me, we published a paper on what are the principles that we should be thinking about when we consider CDR as a serious option, at least to undertake the research. And number one principle is that we can't forget that it is part of the much longer game of climate strategy. That if we think of it as, the silver bullet or whatever metaphor you want to use, it's not going to work. But the second principle is equally important, which is that it's not just about carbon. It is about the social impact. It's about economic impacts in other sectors. It's about environmental impacts beyond carbon, which is why the Convention on Biological Diversity had such a strong position on putting a moratorium on large-scale work on climate engineering technologies, which could impact biodiversity. This brings me to the two other principles, which is that we can't bet that it's going to turn out right. So like a venture capitalist, you're betting on 10 maybe technologies, but only 2 might succeed. But with what metrics will we evaluate failure? At what stage will we say no more on this technology and something else? Right? And that requires governance as well. And when we do that, we ensure that we are not lumping all CDR, all carbon removal technologies in one way. Both Thelma and I said these are 2 buckets, but that does not mean the technologies within these buckets are all evaluated in the same way. So it's this nuanced approach that is necessary beyond looking at the equation that, yes, if we overshoot, we have to remove the carbon. The question is how, with what consequences, where, and with whose permission.
Thank you, Arunabha. We have a question from one of our participants today, from Mujibur Rahman, about technical research. The question is there any research on waiting for a large volcano eruption to start a global cooling, like Tambora eruption in 1815, but in modern times? Arunabha, would you like to take this question?
Well, a lot of the research that has been triggered on solar radiation management in recent years has actually drawn on the natural sort of experiment that underwent in the early 90s when Mount Pinatubo erupted and led to a significant cooling at a planetary scale because of the amount of sulfur that got emitted. So now that is what has happened. The question is, can we mimic nature? And do we know enough of nature with all its intricacies beyond just the carbon cycle, at the hydrological cycle, in terms of ozone and so forth, to be able to even attempt that, right? So yes, the short answer is yes, that is the very basis of trying to mimic what a volcano is in terms of putting stratospheric aerosols. But the uncertainties that Thelma pointed out do remain.
Thelma, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to complement somehow the response from Arunabha. So if we look in the pathways that have been assessed by IPCC for the special report on 1.5, we did not include the potential of natural events like, large eruption. It's basically what humans can do, right? So it's basically, the big mitigation efforts, the big emission reductions, how we can do it, where we can do it, how much it costs. But also there is this, obviously, if we look at the solar radiation modification, it is very analogous to the way that a volcano works, right? So you have lots of particles in the atmosphere. So it reflects a lot of the solar radiation incoming. So the principle is basically the same. However, there is a huge, huge difference. When you have a big volcanic eruption, there is a cooling effect. So there is a rapid decrease in surface temperature, as Arunabha has mentioned. And for Pinatubo, we had about 0.5 degrees, globally in average decrease in surface temperature. But that doesn't last for too long. That's the issue. So although the principle of solar radiation modification is the same, the issue is the solar radiation, which has been mentioned by Arunabha in his presentation, which is the termination effect, which is complicated. It's extremely complex. Once you have SRM implemented and deployed, it has to be there for as long as you have very high CO2, concentrations. So you cannot terminate it. You cannot just say, now we just turn it off. So as long as you have high CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and you have deployed SRM, you need to maintain it. And otherwise, you may just have a very rapid effect of warming, which is going to be really, I would say, complicated to address. So although we see this analog with the volcanoes, how long it persists is how long you have to have the effect of these part of this radiation being reflected back has to continue with the SRM being deployed. That's an important point.
It is absolutely important. We can't ignore this. And this is why all the mitigation and adaptation efforts are so paramount to the fight against climate change. These are all complementary solutions if they end up being solutions, but we still are very far away from having all the knowledge necessary to be able to make this assessment. Okay, well, let's move on.
Arunabha, may I, Alia, have a question to Arunabha? Because I don't remember. Arunabha, do you remember? I remember having come across how many Pinatubos you would have to have per year to have the effect that we want, the cooling effect. I remember I have seen a very intensive number, but I cannot remember precisely.
I don't recall it either, but again, that goes back to the amount of overshoot, right?
Yeah.
So it is, sorry to be crude about this, but, if you have a hangover and you think the next morning you can pop a pill and get rid of the hangover, what is your incentive structure? Is your incentive structure to limit the number of pills that you consume the next morning, or limit the number of glasses of wine you drink the previous evening? right? And that is the moral hazard, right? If
Yeah.
we rely on overdosing on those, pills the following morning, we are actually walking down a very, very slippery slope. Right? It'll have all sorts of impacts. It'll have the termination effect. But it also poses a big question then, what is it that we're doing?
Yeah.
And this question relates to the first question that was asked of what and where are we having these discussions? We should evaluate every single major emitting region or country against what this would mean for climate altering technologies. What does China's 2060 commitment mean in terms of what that would require us to do in terms of investment in climate altering technologies? What does the EU's commitment mean? What if Vice President Biden gets elected as President Biden and his plan gets implemented? Even then, how much of the wedges for climate action would be reliant on carbon mover, right? Or would be reliant on reflecting sunlight back into space, right? So my earnest request to the listeners here and those who might watch this video later is ask yourself two questions. Are we relying on moderating the consumption of wine in the evening or on popping a lot of pills the next morning? And if it is either of those options, how are we governing it? Who is regulating? Because if I'm popping pills without a prescription, that's bad as well.
And Alia, if I may compliment just something that popped in my mind is that, okay, suppose you have an overshoot scenario, and it was very good that Arunabha mentioned the number of peanut tubers that we will need per year is going to be obviously a function of how much the overshoot is, right? But it's, so to bring to 1.5, which is what we want to do, right? So we'll have an overshoot, but you still want to bring it down to 1.5 or lower than 1.5. But it's not, it might take decades. So it's not instantaneous. That might be taking, some time. But it's not only bringing it down, it's how you sustain it there. So if you, reach the 1.5, you have to sustain it there. So that's also the big question mark that we have. And the reliance on all these technologies for how long we are going to have to sustain them in place. And considering that, CDR options, some of them have the permanence issue that has also been mentioned before. They might work very nicely, like, reforestation. We know they will, take up the CO2 from the atmosphere. It's absolutely well known. But then for how long they are going to play this role of removing CO2? And what is the potential risk of reversals? Especially considering that, even the present climate change that we have, which is already impacting in terms of droughts that we have seen. Because this, I'm not associating all the fires that we are seeing in the world to climate change. But we knew that the potential risks of climate change would be to increase the frequency, the intensity, right, of these events, extreme events, including fires and droughts and floods, right? So that's a potential risk that we have on land-based approaches. Not only reforestation, but you would say basically all of them that I see. So this is something that we need to take into consideration, right? Not only for the CDR, but also our mitigation options have to take into account, I would say first, the need to have the transformation in all areas. But energy has been one of the main drivers of the climate change. And obviously, I'm not saying that land-based approaches are not, useful. They are. But we have also to focus on all of this as a big package and also try to avoid the moral hazard of, oh, we have technologies out there that can take us out of this, big problem. And relying on those and looking in the future as being the salvation of the world is the worst path that humanity could take. So I think that it's time we start to look this globally with a lot of responsibility and take the scientific messages, which are already very strong, very strong. And they're not saying that all these options are salvations. They all have risks. They all have implications, different implications. We are still to learn, potential risks that we have not yet been able to assess scientifically. So more to come. And as we evolve in the IPCC with, the new assessment reports, they will always bring the updated scientific knowledge on these issues. But it is time that we really, take a big conscious. It's interesting, Elia, I'm going to finalize with this remark. IPCC has mentioned in the 1.5 special report that it is not impossible to limit the global warming to 1.5 at the end of this century. However, it did say that it would take unprecedented transformations in all areas of society, be it energy, industrial processes, agriculture, residual, constructions, transport, and everything, right? However, take a look. I'm not saying that there is anything positive about COVID, where we are now. But we could say that we have very rapid changes, not only in the way things have been carried out, but also in the large sums that have been, make possible or put forward to help go out of this. So what I'm saying with this is that maybe this is a clue that rapid changes may be possible.
Thank you, Thelma.
So I leave this as a message, not positive about COVID, but it says that we may, have, rapid changes in both ways, putting financial resources, which I hope will come also to help developing countries to do more.
Thank you, Thelma. And I just want to ask one last question to close this event. And I'd like to hear both your thoughts to wrap up the event. In terms of risks and ethical concerns, especially regarding research, how do we start to address these? We've talked about some of the issues around inclusiveness and transparency. What are the steps that need to be taken? And should they be addressed as research goes ahead or beforehand? Should we let Arunabha answer this first?
Have a go on this one first?
Yes, in just 1 minute, we're wrapping up now.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. My answer is hand in hand rather than beforehand or after. You can't. I mean, I gave that metaphor of the drug and the prescription. So the point is, what is the prescription is not saying that you can't take the drug. It's simply saying that you have to take it in moderation, or someone else will determine how it is that you consume it, what form it takes, etc. Scientists tend to, some scientists tend to think that any talk of governance is an impingement on the freedom of science, and is denying them their right to pursue their lines of inquiry. But I would think more enlightened scientists working in this area would think that governance is going to be the check and balance that we are all used to in democratic settings. If governments think that legislatures don't have any role and legislatures think that the courts have no role, then we wouldn't have democracy. Equally, if we think that we can only rely on our self-governance as scientists, and that would suffice, it's foolhardy to have that assumption, especially if our efforts are going to have planetary impact. And therefore, the way the research evolves should impact how the governance evolves, and equally how governance conversations evolve should then direct some questions for further research inquiry. For instance, I said, a governance question would be, are you covering the impact on the tropics sufficiently? Because that's where the bulk of the world's population lives. And that feeds into a research question that is sufficient research funding going towards addressing the empirical gap we have in our research in terms of the impacts on the tropics. So it has to go hand in hand. There's no other way.
Thank you, Arunabha. We have 2 minutes left. Thelma, if you want to answer this in 1 minute.
Thank you, complimenting Arunabha. So Arunabha, on top of that, I think that we need also, not only thinking of the international governance, the governance of research broadly speaking, but we also need to do some homework internally. So the national governance that engages as we have already mentioned this before, the civil society, indigenous people, the communities, and so on. Why? Because, countries should have a perception already of where are the opportunities? Where are the opportunities where they could contribute? Let's take, for instance, bioenergy. Oh, okay, just an example. Let's take BECCS, right? So where are the opportunities? Where we can do it safely so it doesn't compromise food security, where it doesn't compromise the land tenure issue that needs to be addressed. So this conversation needs to happen internally. So not only looking at the negative sides of these things, but they have also to look at the opportunities and they start to do the homework of the limits of their contribution in a way that it ensures sustainable development, ensures as much as possible, achieving also the sustainable development goals. This is not going to be true always, but, to identify the portfolio of options that they have. And that is country specific, regional specific. And this is what should be the lessons to be learned. And then, exploring this to really try to find the best portfolio, minimizing the trade-offs and maximizing the synergies, especially with the sustainable development goals. So this is my last message in 1 minute.
Thank you, Thelma. Thank you, Arunabha. This is all the time we have today. I'd just like to point out that we had a very interesting conversation with both Thelma and Arunabha and other guest speakers a few weeks ago on the same subject in the format of a campfire chat. It's posted on our website if you'd like to hear different perspectives on this issue. And as I said earlier, C2GLearn has a wide array of online content that we are happy to share with you so you can dive a little deeper into this subject. Please fill out our survey at the end of the event to give us some feedback on how we're doing with these online events. It's a learning process, I'm sure, for most people in this pandemic times. We look forward to the next session with both Thelma and Arunabha. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Alia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.